Today. I'm here with Fatou Barry, a brand strategist and founder of PR Girl Manifesto, which is one of the largest digital communities for PR women and girls and folks in the country. And we're here today to kind of continue the conversation last year between Fatou and Taylor about diversity and inclusion in the industry, making sure everyone is represented and seen, and really just actionable tips for PR professionals on how you can succeed regardless of your race, your gender, your age. You shouldn't have to feel that there are any barriers for you in this industry. And my name is Mega Pai, and I'm a board member of PRSA Pittsburgh, and I'm on our D&I committee, which is hosting this event. So without further ado, hello, Fatou. Let me kick it off with our first question. Are there any definitive areas in public relations that are taking a turn in growth or definition? What can graduates or new entrants of any age and cross-discipline do to excel in communications, and has the skill set changed in any way?
Of course. Well, let me just start off by saying thank you all for having me here. I love joining PRSA Pittsburgh, so it's great to be back. And yeah, so I think one of the things that's happening this year, which I'm not just this year, but has been happening in the last couple of years that I really love about the PR industry, is that PR no longer feels linear. I think in the past, it seemed like there was a very tried and true way to get into the PR industry. And what we're seeing now, I think, as a result of, some outdated practices, I think in general, the pandemic has changed how a lot of people view their industries and their work. But specifically in PR, I think we're seeing a lot of innovation, and it's allowing for individuals from non-traditional pathways to enter the industry, which is super exciting, because as we know, those things are what changes an industry, and I think allows for more people to see themselves in an industry that's typically niche. So one, I think it's going to be easier for people who are trying to enter the public relations space, which is great. And then I think cross-discipline, right, is you're going to be able to see a lot more transferable skills into this space, because PR is not just about just knowing how to write anymore. I know when I entered the industry, the biggest thing that people told me was as long as you know how to write, know how to write. And it's not the only thing that's in PR, that's considered PR anymore. We're looking at brand management. We're looking at digital, right? Digital PR is really kind of becoming the norm of really being able to intertwine traditional PR practices with social, with branding, with experiential. So I think one, of course, the skill set has changed. I think definitive areas, of course, is that we're looking at an industry that's more multidisciplinary than it used to be. And I think when we're talking about how to excel in comm, specifically if you're a new grad, if you're coming in from another industry, I think really when being open, right, to being flexible in terms of what your role in PR could look like, but also being well versed in multiple things. You can be a great writer, but relationship management, really knowing how to talk to people and to engage and interact with people, and really I think individuals who lean into innovation and who lean into creative ways of telling stories and getting placements are going to do really well. So I definitely would say being flexible and also leaning into creativity are just things that folks can do to excel in comm.
Yeah, those are all really good points. I think that's something people don't always realize about PR. You have to really be good with people in order to speak with your journalists, clients, your colleagues, really just anyone. And I think that's a fun part of the job too, though. It's it can be nerve-wracking, but then once the nerves calm down, it can be a great way to connect and bond.
For sure. I feel it was I just personal anecdote, getting on the phone used to be terrifying for me.
Me too. I was can I just email them instead? Why do I have to call them? Yeah.
I'm do I have to talk? Do I have to talk to them in person? But I think even that relationship tidbit you're talking about, being able to carry a conversation on the phone and kind of showing personality or being able to express that personality as well, I think has helped. And just being a kind person also in relationship management. Those are things that I have learned through being uncomfortable and picking up the phone and calling.
Yeah, definitely. It goes a long way to building those personal relationships. So
Yeah.
always a plus. So our next question is, how can PR professionals make a difference during nationally celebrated months like that? Excuse me, Black History Month and Women's History Month?
Yeah, so I think by we're PR pros are communicators, right? Like where whatever the medium is, we're communicating something. And I like love that we're responsible for telling beautiful, like some of us for telling beautiful, diverse stories. So when I'm thinking about like really making imprints during like nationally celebrated months, the biggest thing to me is I feel like because many companies and brands and orgs tend to kind of like tread on the safety line, right? Of, all right, well, this feels safe, this feels appropriate, we won't get canceled for this. Like they're almost like, you know, a checkbox of like what the stories you're telling during these like these celebratory months look like. But I feel like as PR professionals, like to really make a difference, it's kind of like the creativity tidbit I talked about. Like we have to like not be afraid to tell different stories. We have to like not be afraid to do things a little bit differently. So I think like for PR professionals who are looking to make a difference, really aligning like whatever initiative or campaign or whatever's happening like internally or externally within like the company or the brand that you're working with, aligning it with stories that aren't typically told, right, in this space. I think we look at Women's History Month as a celebration of women, but is there a way to celebrate women, but also bring attention to the many areas in the world where like women are still like, you know, up against some pretty like, you know, just hard and like big barriers. Like, is there a way that we can also like align this with something that's like impactful, that's changing communities, you know? Women's History Month, how are we not only celebrating women, but is there anything like local to us that we can align ourselves with in terms of like helping to either give, you know, some type of like financial donation or implementing some type of like program that lives like long past Women's History Month or Black History Month. So I think when we're talking about making a difference, one, we're talking about how we're like the stories that we're helping brands and organizations tell, how we're bringing those stories to life. And then I also think like just as personal communicators or like PR pros, how are we, I think, honoring the themes of the month in our own day-to-day, in our own like lived experiences. So I think on the professional side, there's the telling and the supporting of just like stories and I think initiatives that typically don't get attention. And I think we're talking about like personally, what can we do is how are we doing the work in our own like industries? Like as a PR professional, what am I doing to make sure that like, you know, Black PR professionals are like heard, they're being you know, treated not only equally but equitably, like all those things. As a woman, right, am I standing in the gap for other comm professionals, other female comm professionals? Like just things like questions like that we can ask ourselves.
Yeah, those are all definitely great points. And I think that's important in continuing to put light on those things all year round, you know, like the months kind of bring it to light, but then we really need to go and do the work all year. So, you know, because hopefully you have, you know, people of color and women working for your organization all year. So there's not only one month when they're important.
It's not. Women's issues are issues every day.
Yeah.
Black issues are issues every day.
Yeah, exactly. So our next question, let me just pull this up here. Sometimes populations don't feel quite accepted when onboarded to respective companies. Many times there are feelings, oops, sorry, having some technical difficulties here.
You're fine, you're fine.
Just gonna be, okay, there it is. Sometimes populations don't feel, this page is really leaping around right now.
Like, it's the age. I'm like still in this like space of like we're like what 2 years into everything being virtual, but like
yeah,
and like you can't trust technology.
yeah, and I think the internet connection here seems to be good. It's just the Google Doc of questions that's kind of leaping around. Let me refresh the page.
Okay.
Help. Okay, here it is. So sometimes populations don't feel quite accepted when onboarded to respective companies. Many times there are feelings of exclusion and or a constant fight for awareness and a respective voice. What can underserved communications professionals do to overcome the disconnect when it's supposed to be their time to excel, mentor, and close the gap? What can companies do to help bridge this gap?
So this question is like, it's my response to it. I don't want to say it's radical, but I think I have like a different
Yeah.
I just have a different viewpoint, because I'm a big person of like, go where you're celebrated, go where like you have belonging, go where people like respect you and respect the work that you do and who you are as a person, right? So my natural inclination is to say like, it might be time to reset, like it might not be your place, because that's just how I move and how I encourage people to move. Because I think that for so long, people who have been in underserved communities, like we've done the work, like, like we've done the work, we've been just being candid, like we've done the work, we've been patient. And it's we keep, I think trying. I'm being careful with my words, because again, like I can be very like leave, like get out, but I think I think of course like making your concerns known, right? I think in any situation, before you pack your things and you go or you pack up, there's like conversations, there's holding people accountable to the things that they say, or like people are saying that they're an organization or a company or a brand that is inclusive, that is equitable, that is all of these things, like hold their feet to the fire. These are the things that they're saying that they are, and that is the expectation going into it. I really do feel like it's more on the responsibility of the company, right, to bridge the gap and to make sure that people feel accepted. So I think in terms of overcoming the disconnect, if you are holding people's feet to the fire, trying to hold them accountable, if you are voicing your concerns and you are still not being like heard, you still do not feel belonging, you still do not feel like your company is making an honest effort at creating an environment that is safe. Because if we think about it, like inclusion is about like a big part of it is about feeling like seen and heard. And if you're not seen and heard, how can you feel safe? Right. So like then it becomes like, okay, well, this is not the environment that I can excel in. But I think when we're talking about companies, what they're supposed to do, because it's not even help, but what they're supposed to be doing is really, getting an understanding of like each of the individual experiences that are there, especially if it's supposed to be a time, right, where when you're supposed to be excelling, when you're supposed to be mentored, I think companies have to have like just frequent check-ins. It needs to be a bottom line that all of your employees feel as though like the company is building an environment and a company culture that they feel as though like they can excel, they can grow in. And I think that takes a lot of internal, like taking the mirror, right? If you're at a company and taking a look in the mirror and seeing a reflection, like, cast it back at you of like, are you checking in with your employees regularly? Like, are you just talking about inclusion? Are you talking about like these individual experiences when problems arise versus like doing the active work to ensure that like the environment that you're building is one that, values one, values exclusion, two, also values like diversity of like experience and thought, all of that. Do you even have like a team that that their focus is that? Because I think that's another thing there we found, or we saw, that a lot of companies didn't have diversity, inclusion and equity, like teams or directors or anything of that. So I think companies need to, like, it needs to be a bottom line. And I said this last year too, the same KPIs that like we, are expected when you're looking at like, have we met our benchmarks? Have we done the work that we need to do? Like fostering an inclusive environment and making sure that all your employees like have the space to grow, to excel, and that they're actually being mentored and poured into needs to be a KPI too. It needs to be a bottom line. You need to look at it like, wow, are we even asking our talent, right? are we asking our talent like what they need from us, where are their gaps? And I think that's an important thing, like asking questions, listening, and then actually like making action items and actionable plans to fix those things. Because it's not just like a check, right? It's not just a check mark.
Yeah.
I think we've seen that the world is ever growing, that like we as a people just like we continue to evolve, which means that the work of making sure that everybody feels included, everyone feels supported, everyone feels as though like they have access to mentorship, to growth, needs to continue changing. I'd say yes. I'd say it falls more so on companies than it does the communications professionals that are coming from underserved communities. And I would say, again, go where you like don't have to fight to be seen, to be respected, to be supported, and to be like poured into in your own development.
Yeah, those are definitely great points, because I do think like sometimes the burden, generally can fall on employees, but like you said, it shouldn't be. It should be the employer to create that safe space. And you get fresh ideas by making people feel seen and heard.
Yeah,
so that's important. And that's something, people of color and women generally feel passionate about their own issues. But it's something that, our white colleagues should be able to help with.
Yeah. And I think it goes even like, because I've noticed, especially like when we talk about, DEI, I think most people look at it through like the lens of race and ethnicity. And I think that's just because it's what's mirrored back at us. But even like us, right, as folks who would be considered marginalized, like I need to make sure that I'm just not worried about the lived experience that directly affects me, but the lived experience that other people, that are in this ecosystem of work are also feeling. I need to be like cognizant of, it's not like, it's the whole idea of like intersectionality, right? Like a black woman and a black woman and a white woman are going to have two different experiences. A black woman and a black like trans woman are going to have two different. So there's like all these layers, and a black immigrant, like, so like there's such intersectionality. And I think like when we talk about D&I, and this might be a bit of a tangent, so I apologize. But I think, again, this idea of looking at it as linear when it's not, is something too that I think is very important when we're talking about companies bridging the gap as well. Because you could think that you're doing like work, and you're doing work for that one, community, but there's a whole other, identity that's being left out or feeling as though they're not supported as well. So I think that one, again, as I said, it's on the role of the companies more so than I think it is the communications professional, but also I want to like challenge companies and also us as comm professionals to really like explore like what it means to be aware of all of these lived experiences and understand that DE&I is not linear at all.
And that's a really good point about intersectionality too, because it's not like, we experience these things in a vacuum or these microaggressions because of certain separate characteristics. Sometimes you can experience it because of like things that overlap, so that's definitely a really great point. Let me see. You answered one of these questions already too. So I'm going to go to this other question. In the news, some stories are repetitive and there never seems to be visible movement on problems. So what can PR professionals do in the area of policy to make a change, or to even communicate the change? Yeah,
so I think this is the question that we were talking about as well in the area of policy. So I'm very big on like not taking up space in like niche industries that that the work that I do looks a lot different than somebody who's in the policy making space as a comm professional. But I think when we're talking about like in general, like what PR professionals can do to communicate changes that are happening is, again, in like the delivery of how we're telling these stories, right? I think because of like the news cycle, which most PR and comm professionals will know, like when the media is fixated on something or wants to showcase or share a certain narrative, like that's a narrative that's going to be told. But I also think it's about finding like new ways to tell the story that might not necessarily, and again, the route that I would go about that might not necessarily be like the traditional way that we're looking to communicate change. are you still interviewing or offering interviews with just stakeholders, right? Or is there something that's more innovative, that's more like that's just different, that we can convey this information? And that's the line of thinking that I typically would go about it. But again, I'm big on not taking up space in industries that I directly am not involved in. And I think policymaking is one of those niche routes when you're thinking about like the roles of PR and comm professionals. So someone who actually is in policy making or is working within an organization or a team that's dedicated to that might feel differently and might like have a different response to that.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. Like as comms pros, we kind of frame the stories, but we can't create the stories, nor should we. We just have to give a truthful lens. And we have to highlight different angles for those stories.
Yeah, and I think also like in the area of like ethics too, like we gotta like, we have to tell the truth, right?
Yeah.
I think sometimes like, and I can imagine that, individuals within specific niches within like being a PR pro might feel pressured, right, to tell a different type of story for the people that they are working for. But I think it's like, this is one of those things where I feel like we just gotta like, we have to tell the truth. And I think we're seeing a lot more of that. I think in the past, right, PR professionals were known as spin doctors or spin, we are the people that would make anything look good, or we could sell it, right? But I think now we're seeing a lot of PR pros who are like actually saying, no, like I don't want to be known as that, and I don't want to do that. I want to tell the truth. I want to make sure that the brands, organizations, the people that I'm working with are actually like, what we're putting out there about them is actually true.
Yeah, definitely. And I think like sometimes now the job nowadays is like telling the truth about things that might not be heard of as much. So just telling those perspectives that don't get to be heard and kind of illuminating like different parts of the truth that are just not brought to life or that are not part of the main narrative.
Because it's a beautiful thing too. Like one of the things that's always amazed me about like PR and comm is that we're responsible for telling stories, right? So even like when things happen and like traditionally like we'd see comm professionals like stay silent about it or not really like speak up about it. I'm like we have more power than I think many of us realize that we do in this space, because we are storytellers, right? We are pushing, we're telling stories, but like we all know that stories change stories and change narratives, change lives, right? And so I think like I love that like I think as an industry and as communicators, especially like a lot of us, I think we talk about who have come from underserved communities, like we are really, I think using our roles as comm professionals and using them to change, like not just like to like make dreams come true or tell, or, get our, the traditional, oh yeah, we're going to get our clients like placements. No, but we are really doing some phenomenal work that is changing narrative, that's helping support organizations that are really like on the front lines of various causes and initiatives. So I love that about the industry, whether it's, which I think it's always existed, but I think now we're seeing a lot of that pushed to the forefront.
Like more authentic stories rather than trumpeting different things like people thought that PR pros did in the past. Let me see. So the next question is, recent and current events can seem repetitive, and there are certain populations that cause harm to other populations, physically and financially. So how do communicators respond to such actions, engage communities, and continue to advocate? I think you already answered this one though, because you said it's up to us to tell the stories, not to.
I think it ties it definitely ties in. And again, I love the idea of like continue to advocate, because I think that's what we are. We're advocating on the behalf of like our clients, but we're also advocating like on behalf of the stories that we believe should be told, right? I think specifically too, I one of the things that I love that you said is telling stories that aren't typically like told. And I think that's such an important thing. Because I remember when I first got into the industry, this was the era of like DKNY PR girl. So like immediately people were like, they heard PR and they were like, and you know, the whole like Samantha Jones from Sex. So like they like, like there was a certain, I think, image or perception of PR. And I think like people, we're peeling back the layers and people are seeing how far like being a PR pro, being a comm professional can take you. Like you can work in health, you can like social impact. Like I have such a tremendous like amount of respect for PR professionals who are in these spaces, right? That typically weren't given attention or seen as like boring, because like that's some serious work. So I think when we're talking about like communicating change, I think again it's this idea of also like maybe, you know, when you're considering what industry you want to even do PR for, right? Like lean into the, if you are somebody that's like driven by like a lot of like heart, like human relation stuff, like consider, you know, engaging in a niche in PR that's typically not, you know, thought of, because then you're also helping bring awareness to, again, that industry. You're helping bring awareness to those stories, and that could again change someone else's life.
Yeah, I mean, even I have a friend, we used to work at an agency together, and then she went to work for a big healthcare organization, and she got to help them with the vaccine communications, you know, where people can find vaccines, timing of vaccines, you know, different safety things kind of surrounding all of that. And it's really impactful work. And it's not something we would have thought of, you know, 5 years ago when we joined the field. So yeah.
Love that.
Next up, we have a question about jobs. So as the US added 687,000 jobs in February, experts are saying that this is a sure sign of a resilient economy. The pandemic has shown us that employees are unhappy and that companies have to be flexible in their management of employees. But in many areas, workers are not available. Is this telling us, if anything, about underserved populations? This kind of goes back to what you said about employers before. Like if you build an equitable, inclusive organization, people will come. And if you're not getting the right candidates, then maybe you need to rethink your company culture.
Yeah, I think it's that. I think the Great Resignation, right? We're seeing this across so many different spaces.
Yeah.
PR is not exempt to it at all. And I think it's definitely layered, right? So I think that there's one, just for an industry too, I think that typically, I know going into it, the first thing that I was told was like, oh, be prepared to commit like long hours. Like, again, these tropes that we hear about PR professionals, always connected. You don't, like don't rest. Like you got to be available for clients. You got like, we're like things like that are really like harmful. If we
exactly. But then we took as normal whenever we're new.
Yeah, I used to wear being available, working all the time as a badge of honor. Like I was like, yeah, like I'm doing the thing. Like I don't talk about work anymore. Like when I don't have to talk about work, because I've worked so hard to decenter work from my life. But I think what we're seeing too is just like specifically if we're talking about underserved, and I don't even want to use underserved. They want to just use like different lived experiences, because I also feel as though like spending the last year and a half, 2 years, most of us at home, has also like caused a lot of us to have like priority shifts. Whether one, priority shifts, two, many people I think have had to deal with mental health, right, issues, whether it be for the better or for the worse. But I think what it is too is that like people don't want to go back to the office, because one, we've been shown that you do not need to physically be in an office to get things done, to be productive. And also like people have like different, like, again, this idea of different lived experiences. So we're in a pandemic, right? We typically don't think about who's a caretaker, right? We don't think about who's a caretaker, who has like kids and, no longer has the support that they might have had prior to the pandemic. And who, has maybe just also like learned that they work better like at home. They can still collaborate. So I think what it's telling us too, which I also like am very happy about, is that people specifically in these like communities are just beginning to like reevaluate, what work could look like, And because we've now seen a different possibility, I think we're seeing more people kind of like stand firm in their no of like what it is that they consider to be the working style and working environment that works for them. And I think it's great. Like we've seen also a lot of companies start to go public, right? Because then they can do remote work and they can like ensure that like their employees can work anywhere from the world that they want to. So I think that there's a lot of factors, or not even factors, there's a lot of things that we're learning from the fact that there's so many jobs, so many like new jobs have been introduced into the workforce, but like there's a lack of workers. And I also think like the pandemic pushed a lot of people to also do things on their own terms. Like I like love that we saw an increase in like freelancers, right? Who people didn't feel like they needed to tie themselves to a company, especially in PR. Like maybe you don't have to work in-house. Maybe you don't have to work for a company, an organization. Maybe you can like do your own thing, or maybe you can, or maybe you can, right? And still be able to like be flexible to live where you want. So I think there are a lot of things that were reflected back at us, but I think like the biggest thing for me is that like a lot of us are just not trying to go back into like cultures and offices that weren't the most conducive like to our personal development, to our mental health, and to our growth. And I think that I personally think it's a great thing, because it's like maybe that's what we need to do to like start getting some change in how work culture is seen. I also think what I love about it is that it forces people to like explore a hybrid model, right? Okay, like you can work at home, like it makes sense for you to work at home, maybe come in like once a week, if that come, depending on your location and like how the structure is. But I think we're being told that like people want flexibility and they're not settling for what they thought they had to prior.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. And I think it's been interesting during the pandemic too. People have stopped defining themselves by their jobs as much. And it's more like they're centering who they are as people at the center of their identities, which is really great. Because I think as communications professionals, we were probably all overachievers in school and, really getting that first PR job and saying, oh, I'm, an account executive at wherever was like a really big part of our identities. But now it's still, I feel like we can still be proud of these jobs and these titles, but people are bringing more of their authentic selves, to their work and to their lives too. And it's I loved what you were saying earlier about kind of decentralizing your work from your identity and just bringing in more parts of, your life to your life.
Yeah. And I think it's important. I think it also allows you to like that awareness, I think, and that focus on who you are, not what you do. Or who you are to other people, whether that be like professionally or personally, like just allows you to explore more about yourself. And I think if anything, it brings us closer to like the things that we're supposed to do, whatever that looks like for each individual person. And I love I think the biggest thing too that you brought up is being able to show up as your full self. People don't want to go to a place like, I know for me, like I'm terrible at code switching. So like it was never like I've never been a person who like, of course, I don't think many people enjoy it, but I've never been good at like, compartmentalizing parts of like who I am in order to be perceived as somebody who should be respected. And I think we're seeing that a lot with other people too, who people are just like fully being themselves. And if a company can't take them as they are in the fullness of who they are, then like it's not the company for them, and they're standing in that, which I think is amazing.
I think it's so important for everyone to be able to express themselves just like the way that they normally talk or the way that they would normally be. And like you said, code switching or any type of compartmentalizing just creates this like mental pressure and this burden, and then it's hard to do your job or just live.
It's an emotion. It's an emotional tax. It's an emotional. It's an emotional. I think, and then if we're being honest, it's an emotional tax that mostly people of color, right, take on, of not only going to work and having to do the job, but having to think about like every single like how you're doing the job, how are people perceiving you, right? And it's like unhealthy and it's not fair, because there are definitely groups of people out there who don't have to worry about those things. And so I think it's important. I think it is important for us, people of color to lean into more experiences and more places that allow you to fully be yourself.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it kind of goes with age too. Like when you first enter the field and you're in your 20s or, whatever age you are when you join the field, you feel a certain way and like you have to be a certain way if there are all these people that are older than you around you. But then as you kind of move up through the decades, it just becomes a lot easier to be comfortable and kind of be yourself.
Yeah, and I think like I feel like it's also like similar with people who are coming from non-traditional, like, right, we talk about this like non-traditional pathways. I feel like for so long we've been told that if you want to be in PR, if you want to be in comm, there's a certain way to do it. There's just like, no matter your age, right, like or no matter, like you have to fit this mold, this is what works. And I just think like a lot of us are saying like, screw you to that model and which again, I love like anytime that we're breaking down antiquated systems, that's I'm all for it.
Yeah, because I think to like be able to tell all of these different stories in PR, just like look for those stories that people don't normally see. You have to have an untraditional background. You have to come from different places. You can't all be, a communications major who goes right into the field out of school. There are different ways to get there.
That too. And I love what you said about like, I think it's always been funny to me that when we're looking at like the PR space, right, specifically, and I talk about this responsibility for storytelling and this responsibility to like amplify stories, like that the people telling the stories don't look like the people they're telling the stories about. And I've always found that really like interesting like thing to think about, that like we like the world is changing, but like is our industry truly representative of the way that the world is changing and the voices that are out there and the lived identities, right? Because it affects how you show up in your work. It affects the types of stories you tell. It affects the type of platforms you even tell. Like it's just so ingrained in how you work. And so I like it's something that I hope continues to change. I hope we start to see like more diversity, not just in racial and ethnic like background, not just in freaking like diversity in thought, diversity in experience. I think all those things are very important too.
Yeah, exactly. I know what you mean there, because I think even just as a child of like immigrants and having parents kind of grow up in India, sometimes I'll like notice those types of stories more about first generation kids and things like that. And it's just like nice to see that. But sometimes I wonder, like, if I didn't have that specific background, would I see it as much? Would I notice it as much? Maybe not. And it has to be the same with like other marginalized groups, like a trans woman, like you said, or a gay man. So it's really important to just have people, like from a spectrum of diversity in the room to really help tell those stories, make those decisions, whether it's PR or advertising. So
yeah, and even as we're thinking like far even further than that, like how is our industry evolving too, right? So one of the things that like I've been really trying to educate myself on, because unfortunately, it's not something that it's one of those places where I have blind spots and I have just unconscious, because we all have unconscious bias. I think that's something like everybody has it to some degree. To like, for me, even thinking about like how our industry communicates, right? Like how are we supporting persons with disabilities, right? Are we making sure that like how we're engaging in getting our stories out there, how we're pushing out comms, like is it accessible to everyone? And so like things that like typically you might not make, if you haven't had to like live the experience or you haven't come close like face to face with it, you might not have even given it any thought, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't like there's no value in this, all the value in giving it thought. So I think even things like that, I talk about like even us as like this idea of like cultivating like more diverse communicators that we have at PR Girl Manifesto is rooted in that. It's just not just like the things that I have lived through, the team has lived through, but the experiences that we know nothing about that like have left people out of this industry and left people out of these spaces.
Because really anyone should be able to work in this, anyone should be able to feel like they can work in this industry, so that inclusion is so important. The last question, you actually answered it. It goes into, work-life balance, 9 to 5. But the last part of the question says, has this work transition helped or hurt PR excuse me, has this work transition helped or hurt today's PR professional with maintaining and establishing new relationships? So it kind of goes into like working from home versus working in the office. Has that switch hindered relationships at all? I don't think it has.
I don't either. So I think the internet is this beautiful place. Like it can be a bad,
true.
But it can also be a really beautiful place when it comes to like establishing relationships and I think increasing your network. I think it's just one of those things that like for some people it is hard to like meet people on the internet or engage in new relationships on the internet. But if you think about it, like us being virtual or working remotely or mostly like, collaboratively like online has opened up so many doors, because most of the times, like even just look at like, which I'm still trying to wrap my head around it, but like Meta, like like I feel like we're given new ways to like build relationships. So I think it's actually helped PR professionals, because like I think it's also changed perception of like companies and brands and how they're working with people, right? So instead of going to your local like PR agency or because they're there and they're local, now people are looking for people like from all over. Like, oh, you could be in California, I could be in New York City, but like you're the right fit, and now we can work together because everything is done online anyhow, which is how it should have been, right? So I think it's actually helped with like establishing new relationships. In terms of maintaining, I think it requires us to be more intentional about how we're maintaining relationships. So like I am definitely used to be guilty of this, where I'm like, oh, if I'm on Instagram or if I'm on any type of social media, if I see what's happening in someone's life, like I know what's happening in their life. And that could not be the farthest thing from the truth. So like I've had to like reassess how I check in and how I manage relationships, sending emails more frequently, like asking, hey, do you want to get on a call? Like I want to catch up, like just things like that, not only in personal, but professional relationships as well. Checking in, right, on people that you have partnered with before, on journalists that you have great rapport with, like how are you doing, how is your family doing, is there any if you're close enough, is there anything that I can do, like so I think it's just kind of like put more of a pressure's the wrong word, it's required us to redefine like how we manage relationships, or to us not redefine, reassess how we manage those relationships.
Yeah, that's definitely important. I just, there's just so much to like think about around that space, there's just so much going on, but it is having an online kind of relationship with reporters and everything is still like a very real way to stay connected with them. And sometimes those are connections that you wouldn't have formed in person, like you said.
Yeah, because I mean, I think about like, we weren't really I remember when desk size used to be a thing, like a really popular thing. I think people will still, go and like meet editors and journalists in real life, but it used to be like trying to get a desk side with like a journalist reporter. But I feel like now it's like they're just different ways to go about, I think it also gives a little bit more access. I think journalists are more open now too. Like it's like they'll tell you the types of stories they're looking for. Somebody said, "Oh my God, that's yeah." I remember trying to get time and be like, "Hey, I can come by and show you the." But yeah, I think like everyone's just in a space, I think, where they're a little bit more open to like the ways in which people communicate with them, journalists, reporters. I think even us as like comm professionals, PR professionals too, like we are definitely like seeking community and to be in relation with one another, because it's helpful. Like I love the fact that I think PR feels so much more collaborative than it did before. And I think that that's a really special thing, and I value that so much about the industry, because before it used to be like, at least for me, like when I first got into this space, and I think a lot of what like pushed me to start PR Girl Manifesto is just, it felt like I was in a silo. of like, this is your job. Like, you can't really be friendly with other PR pros because you're all trying to get the same placement. But like, that couldn't be the farthest thing from the truth. And so just, I love that there's like a community is really becoming a pillar of our industry, and we're leaning into each other, leaning on each other, and like helping and supporting each other. And I think that's beautiful.
Yeah, that was really well said. I definitely do too, for PR Girl Manifesto, and just for PRSA Pittsburgh in general. I have friends, like, we've all kind of gotten different jobs over the years, but we still stay in touch by being on PRSA's board. So it's just like nice to see the PR community in Pittsburgh, and it's really become like the communications community in Pittsburgh, just all staying together, because the definition of PR has changed so much. Like you said, it's not just writing. It's not just pitching stories. It crosses over into digital. It covers so many things. So
which is great. Like I said, I'm really excited for continued innovation in the space. I think we're going to see a lot of like skilled people enter the space. We're going to learn a lot from individuals who have like new voices, new outlooks, and just like new ways of doing things. So I think it's going to be great. And I think also, like, with everything that's been happening in the world consistently, I think people are also really starting to understand better the value of comms and the value of having people in place who, are communication specialists and communications professionals who can help really, tell these stories, help spread misinformation. Like, it's a really, like, there's so much value in public relations. There's so much value in comm. And I'm really excited that it seems to be like steady, like the perception, the value perception seems to be steadily growing as well.
Yeah, definitely. It's not, what people think it is when they say, oh, you work in communications, is that spin? Like, it's not like that.
Yeah, I remember people used to joke on everyone who went and got a comm degree. Oh, they're a communications major. And right. I was like, well, look at what the comms majors are doing. Like,
exactly. Now. Yeah. Like, it's an important field.
It's so important. It's so important.
And it touches so many aspects of our lives too. Like, even if you're not in communications. Okay, so for the last few minutes of this, if you have any questions, please drop them in the chat. We also have a question from Charlene, who is our D&I committee chair, and she's dropped it for me in a chat that we have. Oh, and Taylor has dropped a comment in here too.
Oh, thank you, Taylor.
Thank you. Taylor was our chair last year and co-chair the year before.
Yeah, she is a legend. We love it. All right. I see. How important is personal branding in this space? Any tips on how to best market oneself from home? So, interestingly enough, I feel like in the last couple of years, personal branding of PR pros has become, I remember at one point it was controversial, like if people were like, so there are two ways to look at this, because I completely understand, like, we're in a space where there's like a lot of competition in the sense of like, it's a market that there's a lot of people in it, right? So you have to stand out somehow, which means that you have to like know what your UVP is, and you need to be able to differentiate yourself. Why should someone work with you? All of that is personal branding. I think it's like, for me, there's a happy medium, right, of being known for specific type of work so that you're getting those opportunities. So like, if anyone asks you like, oh, what type of work does Fatou do? It's rooted in three things. It's rooted in culture, it's rooted in community, and it's rooted in creativity. And that is like intentional on my part, because that's how I want to be perceived. I think it's really important because, especially if you're a freelancer or you're not necessarily working in-house or you're not working with an agency, I think your personal brand is how you stick out, how people see you as an authority or somebody that has knowledge in a space that they can then trust. So I do think personal branding is important. I remember a time when people would be like, no, your job is to like be behind the scenes, and your client is the forefront of the work that you're doing is at the forefront. I agree to some degree with that, but I think that like I love that we're seeing like PR professionals who are doing the work, right? And still, taking care of what needs to be taken care of, but still like creating like names for themselves so that they are attracting the type of opportunities that they want to. in terms of tips on how to best market oneself from home, I definitely agree with that, CG. As a BIPOC employee at an agency, it is very important, because we all know that oftentimes, like, we're required to do more to stand out more. And unfortunately, I think if it's one of those things where you have to be able to, again, like, illustrate your UVP. In terms of, sorry, I just missed it. I know Danica asked, she said, how to best market oneself from home. I think the biggest thing, of course, is, like, for me, the biggest credibility, like how I look at a potential, like, professional, is, like, the knowledge that they have. So I think we're in a great place of, like, even if you can't go to networking events, I mean, they're virtual ones, but there's just still so much information and probably a wealth of knowledge that that you can put out there, for people to, like, get a better understanding of, like, who you are and what you know. I think, proof, right? Proof is always, I think, as people say, the receipts are always very valuable. So being able to showcase, like, case studies, being able to, like, showcase case studies and talk about the work that you're doing, I think those are, like, important things that lean into personal branding. And I also do think it's important, like, to have some type of, like, real estate, social, like, not social, digital, whether it be a website, just something where if I'm looking for information about you, like, I can go, because I love LinkedIn, right? And I think LinkedIn is a great, like, resource, but I also know that LinkedIn doesn't always allow for some of those, like, nuances of, like, personality, where you can really showcase who you are, and what you do and how you do it, that can be translated, like, through a website or one page or social.
Yeah, that's definitely really good advice. And even, like, during the pandemic, when I freelanced for a bit, I got an opportunity because someone saw me posting articles on LinkedIn that I'd written, so she wanted me to write for her. And that was just something I did. I didn't expect it to lead to an opportunity. So it's important to kind of be yourself, show off your own work whenever you can, and just be proud of what you do.
Yeah, I love that.
There's a lot going on in the chat now.
I know.
But let me see. So we have a couple different questions here. One is about the importance of certifications or languages that PR pros need to pursue, and another one is about tips for improving interpersonal skills.
Yeah, I think, certifications are super important, and there's so many of them. And I think they're important for two reasons. I think one, of course, to actually show credibility that you've taken a course, that you've completed a course, or you completed some type of program that makes you credible. But I also think, like, they're always great learning opportunities. So I'm not someone that believes that once what I've learned, like, what you've learned in college is great, what you've learned through, like, experience is great, but there's still always more to learn. And I think it also provides an opportunity to not only learn, but diversify your, right, what's in your toolbox or what's in your Rolodex of, like, offerings for people who are looking at you as, like, a prospective professional that they want to work with. So I definitely, Rochelle, am I saying your name right? I'm sorry, I don't want to butcher it. Is it right? Okay. Yeah, I think certifications are super important, and there's so many of them that are available for free. Like, Muckrack does a ton, and I love that. And there are so many other resources, and they're free. And you'll find that, like, individuals who take them either, now have a certification or have learned something, like, new, or have gotten a better understanding of a specific, like, niche or a specific tool that they can use. Yeah, and then I see Chris's question. You talked at the beginning about improving your interpersonal skills with journalists and clients. Do you have any specific tips to this? I think it's practice. Like, you can project, like, all of the things that you're gonna do, but you just gotta do it. Like, you can have the checklist of, like, all right, I know, like, I'm supposed to do this, or, like, this is, like, what, how to build relationships, but you just gotta do it. So for me, the way that I got comfortable picking up the phone and calling anyone, like, whether it be a prospective partner, a journalist, or anybody, was just by doing it. And, like, maybe, trembling a little bit internally. I don't think the other person picked up on it, but, like, as you continue to do it, there are just some things that it might still not feel like like this, for example,
Yeah.
I am not I like public speaking, but it's not my like comfortable space because I'm the type of person that's thinking about like 10 things at once. Like, am I enunciating? Am I speaking too fast? So all those things are happening in my head while I'm saying what I'm saying. But because I've done it so many times, I've gotten to a place of like, a little bit of comfortability with it where it is not like still not my favorite thing to do, but I can do it. Right. And I am comfortable doing it. So I think it's about putting like that into practice is going to be the biggest tip that I can give, because you can be in your head, you can write down all of like, I should do this, I should do that. But until you do it and you keep doing it and you repeat it, like then it becomes like a second nature for you. Like you don't get scared picking up the phone. You don't get scared like having a conversation, talking to someone new, because you know that you've done it. You've done it a few times. So at the very least, you can do it.
Yeah. I think that's just a great point with anything in life, just kind of doing it over and over again, gets rid of the nerves and kind of gets rid of that shyness. And that's a great point about public speaking too. I have noticed that what I miss about public speaking in real life is you don't see yourself mirrored back at yourself.
I know
that removes a layer of nerves, but here, like you can always kind of constantly see yourself while you're moderating or speaking, and
it's so fun, right? It's
so
fun.
Yeah. But that's something too that I think gets better with like time and practice and just doing more speaking opportunities, like you said. But thank you everyone for attending today's event. Thank you for speaking so much.
Thank you for having
hearing from you. And this will be available on the PRSA blog. We have one of our committee members writing a recap, and we'll have a recording of the session in there. So if you go to our website, prsapgh.org, you'll be able to view it in the coming weeks. And you can also follow our social channels at PRSAPGH if you would like to see more updates from PRSA Pittsburgh. But thank you everyone for joining, and have a great night.
Yay. Good night, y'all.
Thank you. Bye.